The Battle of Savo Island took place on the night of October 8th into the morning of the 9th in 1942. This battle occurred approximately 2 months after the devastating Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway, which resulted in the devastation of the Japanese main carrier fleet. Many people believe that after the American victory at Midway, the United States won every battle against the Japanese for the rest of the war. However, this is not true. The Battle of Savo Island is known as one of the most decisive, embarrassing naval defeats in American military history. This naval skirmish was the first of many naval engagements to come in the 6-month-long Guadalcanal campaign, which America was waging in order to seize control of the Solomon Islands. The geographical location was of great strategic importance to both the Japanese and the Americans because it was located in between Hawaii and Australia. If the United States controlled these islands, they would be able to have a much more direct, secure line of communication with their main ally in the region, but if the Japanese maintained control of these islands, they would more easily be able to sabotage these lines of communication. The United States was pursuing this offensive due to their Pacific strategy of island hopping. This strategy consisted of the U.S. overtaking Japanese-held islands through the use of naval and air support that was followed by a ground invasion. These islands would then be used as air bases or unsinkable aircraft carriers that brought them closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Since the vast majority of the American war effort was directed towards the European theater rather than the Pacific theater, this strategy was meant to strategically outmaneuver the Japanese rather than capture every single island in between Hawaii and Japan, as they did to Germany and Berlin. This battle only lasted a couple of hours, but it left the U.S. Marines stranded on Guadalcanal and Florida Island without any naval support whatsoever. The Marines had just recently made an uncontested amphibious landing there to secure a vital Japanese air base. This airfield was of crucial importance to both sides as it would allow either side to project more air power over the other and was a crucial step in America's island hopping campaign. This Japanese nighttime surprise attack on the Allied fleet was meant to disrupt the Marines' land invasion of Guadalcanal. The Japanese successfully deceived the Allied forces when they attacked them during the night, and the Allies made the mistake of assuming the Japanese would not do such a thing because it was not something that they would have done themselves. The Allied fleet was ill prepared for such an attack because they were not expecting the Japanese to attack during the night, and because they were also too heavily dependent on their primitive, unreliable radar that they believed would pick up any Japanese naval encroachments. At the beginning of the war, Japanese intelligence when it came to feeling out the situation before a battle was far superior to the Allied forces, and the Japanese were able to capitalize on it in this situation. Japan was highly skilled when it came to nighttime naval attacks, which would indicate why this initial one was so successful against the Allies. The part of the Allied naval fleet that was attacked was split up into 2 groups that were separated into a northern group and a southern group. The northern group consisted of 3 American heavy cruisers, which were the USS Vincennes, the USS Quincy, and the USS Astoria. The southern group was composed of 2 Australian cruisers and 1 American cruiser, which were the HMAS Australia, the HMAS Canberra, and the USS Chicago. These heavy cruisers were accompanied by multiple American destroyers, but these destroyers ended up having very little impact on the battle at the end of the day. 2 of these American destroyers were tasked with patrolling the choke points into the part of the Solomon Sea that the Allied fleet was located in. The destroyer patrolling the southern choke point failed to notice the incoming Japanese fleet led by Admiral Mikawa that was composed of 5 heavy cruisers, which were the IJN Chokai, which was the flagship, the IJN Aoba, the IJN Kinugasa, the IJN Furutaka, and the IJN Kako, along with 2 heavy cruisers, which were the IJN Tenaru and the IJN Yubari, and 1 destroyer, which was the IJN Unagi, and this fleet was on its way to wreak havoc on the unsuspecting Allied fleet. The southern fleet was attacked first, but they were without their leader, Admiral Crutchley, of the flagship HMAS Australia. This left the USS Chicago in charge, and when the Japanese fleet opened fire on them and the HMAS Canberra, the crew was unprepared and resting following a long day of duty. Japanese scout planes had flown over the Allied heavy cruisers and dropped illumination flares over them to allow the Japanese to see their targets more clearly. Many Allied sailors heard these planes, but a lot of them assumed that they were friendly planes, leading to mass confusion, making them all the more vulnerable. The USS Chicago was hit by a torpedo right in the bow, and it lost the majority of its power and had no choice but to pull out of the fight. The HMAS Canberra sustained multiple hits from shells, resulting in the death of their captain and a loss of propulsion. Following internal explosions, Australians decided to scuttle the Canberra, permanently retiring her from service. For whatever reason, the USS Chicago did not notify the northern group that they had been attacked. So when the Japanese fleet converged on the northern group in two separate groups, they too were caught off guard. When the Japanese fleet began to attack them, many of the sailors believed that they were experiencing friendly fire, so they were not immediately running to man their battle stations. The captain of the USS Astoria even ordered a ceasefire on the Japanese fleet when they were initially being shelled because he believed it was friendly fire, which ended up being a fateful mistake for the heavy cruiser. The Japanese fleet came and inflicted brutal damage to the American heavy cruisers while simultaneously sustaining minimal damage. This resulted in the USS Vincennes and the USS Quincy being destroyed and sunk. After the Japanese completely devastated the three heavy cruisers, they made their way back with only the USS Ralph Talbot left in their way. The Ralph Talbot was the only lone destroyer patrolling the choke point north of Savo Island, so it did not stand a chance against the entirety of the Japanese fleet. The Ralph Talbot was almost sunk, but had a stroke of good fortune when heavy rains forced the Japanese to pull out of the attack. The Allied forces suffered 1,077 killed and 709 wounded in this brutal defeat, while the Japanese only suffered 129 casualties. The number of Americans that were killed in this battle is almost as high as the number of Marines who were killed in the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Due to such a humiliating loss, this battle is also informally referred to as the Battle of the Five Sitting Ducks. Additionally, the body of water that this battle occurred in eventually became known as the Iron Bottom Sound. Following this brutal blow that had been delivered to the Allied fleet, the Japanese had an opportunity to re-engage the decimated fleet so they could attack the various Allied support ships that were carrying a lot of supplies for the invasion force. Admiral Mikawa, however, decided not to do so because he realized that his fleet would not have the cover at nighttime to conceal his retreat, which would make him more vulnerable to U.S. aerial attack. Mikawa knew that there had been a U.S. carrier group within striking distance and that such a move would put his fleet in danger of being attacked from the air by the nearby U.S. carrier group. What he did not know was the carrier group that he was fearful of had already prematurely pulled out of the region to avoid attack and regroup. This decision to not go after the Allied support ships was a crucial mistake of Mikawa's that was the result of poor intelligence. This hesitation by Mikawa reveals the perceived threat that the aircraft carriers pose due to their unprecedented range and striking capabilities. Had Mikawa pressed on the attack and finished off the support ships, it could have served as a knockout blow to the U.S. Guadalcanal campaign, and the U.S. Marines would have been left stranded on the island with no lifeline whatsoever. Instead, all they did was delay the invasion a little bit as they allowed their stunned enemy to regroup and reorganize a successful campaign. This miscalculation by Mikawa effectively encapsulates the idea of the fog of war and how uncertainty plays such a significant factor when it comes to military planning and execution. This crucial mistake by Mikawa goes against the principle that argues a combatant to not let your enemy recover after they have initially been stunned. Unfortunately for Mikawa, his hesitancy allowed the Americans to regroup and mount a successful Guadalcanal campaign.